Inside of the concentration camps of the Second World War, many people from all walks of life succumbed to the horrific conditions, the violent beatings and the savage executions which occurred at the hands of the SS guards. One of the most awful camps was Buchenwald, a site which was opened before the war began, and it was the largest site within the 1937 borders of Germany. But 280,000 people would pass through the barbed wire fences, and at least 56,000 were killed there by the terrible lack of food, the diseases and the violence. Buchenwald was where even the Commandant Karl Otto Koch would be executed in his own camp, but an early victim of the site was a man whose daughter was at the heart of the Nazi Party and would become the closest friend and confidant of Adolf Hitler and the wife of his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. But what is the story of the slaughter of Magda Goebbels' Jewish stepfather? As always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The future Magda Goebbels was born on the 11th of November 1901 in Berlin, and her mother, Auguste Ritschel, was for a short period married to a man named Oskar Behrendt, a businessman, and he was Magda's allegedly biological father, it is believed. Magda's mother would then divorce him, to then marry a much wealthier and richer Jewish financier, a man named Richard Friedlander. It's believed that Magda was very fond of her stepfather, and she liked him a great deal, and even went as far as adopting the use of his name, and she continued to be known as Magda Friedlander, even when she met Joseph Goebbels, her future Nazi husband, for the first time. She knew of the Jewish connections to her surname, but her early life was rather prosperous, thanks to the money that her stepfather had. Magda would later marry a rich industrialist herself who was twice her age, and this man would order her not to refer to herself as Magda Friedlander, but Magda ignored this. There has been some news articles which have been published in the last decade that states that Richard Friedlander even claimed on his residency card that he was in fact Magda's biological father, and some have questioned whether he and Magda's mother had an earlier affair, and that Magda may have actually been the biological daughter of this man. This would obviously change history forever. Richard Friedlander would adopt Magda as his own daughter, and it's believed they had a very, very good relationship. Magda would of course go on to marry Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Nazi Party, and a man who would be the mouthpiece of it. Goebbels would also be in control of the propaganda, which would perpetuate the evil anti-Semitic policies of the party, and he would create horrific films and caricatures of Jews which were aimed to turn the public's perception against these people. But Magda would go on to become known as the First Lady of the Third Reich, and her actions in this position needed to be carefully thought of. Hitler would go on to launch a huge and widespread persecution of the Jews, and for the wife of the propaganda minister to have a beloved Jewish stepfather was a very shocking thing. It could have resulted in the sacking of Goebbels and the disappearance of the family from Nazi prominence, but Hitler needed Joseph Goebbels and his skill of manipulating the media. He also needed Magda Goebbels, who became his best friend and closest confidant, and Magda would even seek marriage guidance from the Nazi dictator, who, when her husband had many affairs, would chastise Joseph and force him to break things off with his mistress. But Richard Friedlander would find himself arrested as part of the Nazi persecution. He was a Jewish merchant and a wealthy man, and was seen as a very easy target for the state to steal his property and wealth, regardless of who his stepdaughter was. As part of Action Arbeitsschau Reich, which took place in June 1938, more than 10,000 men who were said to have been antisocial aspects of society were deported to concentration camps. During this roundup, around 2,500 Jews were arrested for various reasons, and this included Richard Friedlander. Hitler had ordered these roundups himself, and because of this thousands were sent to concentration camps such as Dachau. Many of these were not considered criminals, but were arrested for just being Jewish, and 1,256 Jewish men were sent to Buchenwald Concentration Camp in the roundup. One of those who arrived at Buchenwald was Richard Friedlander, and when he got there he was said to have been a man who was suffering with some form of physical affliction, and he was said to have been injured possibly by the brutality of the roundup. The commandant of Buchenwald would, from the day it opened, instill a reign of brutality and evil over the prisoners, and he would make sure that the guards were trained in how to make the lives of inmates a living hell. The main cause of death at Buchenwald was the harsh conditions and illness caused by it, as prisoners were malnourished and were starved to death, and many were worked to death through the extermination through labour policy. Many others were also shot on execution sites or were later sent to the gas chambers. It was a horrific camp, and even from its early days, things were incredibly tough. Buchenwald would, in the years later, expand to a huge extent, but Richard Friedlander was forced to work incredibly hard in the labour programmes, and it's believed that he did not tell anyone who his stepdaughter was. Such information could have possibly saved him, or it could have gone the other way, and condemned him quicker to death, as many Nazi guards would not want the information to get out about the First Lady of the Third Reich having a Jewish stepfather. But he continued to work inside of Buchenwald for around 8 months, but on the 18th of February 1939, things got too much for Richard Friedlander's body, and because of the terrible living conditions and the hard work, he died. The death report for Richard Friedlander stated that inside of Buchenwald he died from cardiac muscle degeneration caused by left-sided pneumonia. This was a very common thing which was listed on the death certificates of many of the victims of the concentration camps. Doctors would sign off on this, that prisoners had died from heart failure, and of course they would not waste their time conducting autopsies on the victims. But this leads to a possible piece of speculation that the stepfather of Magda Goebbels may have actually been executed if he was taken ill. He was a man in his late 50s who was doing incredibly hard work with little food and supplies. If prisoners were taken ill inside of the camp, they were often executed using lethal injections to the heart, and with this their death certificates were listed as heart failure. But what is also rather shocking regarding the fate of Richard Friedlander is that he would not be saved by his stepdaughter Magda Goebbels. She was known during the Second World War to have even helped some Jewish people obtain false identification documents to allow them to flee the persecution. But why did she not help her own beloved stepfather, whom she had a great relationship with? Hitler would spare his own Jewish doctor during the roundups, and Magda could have very easily saved her stepfather, but she did not. Did they have an argument before? Did he not approve of her marriage to Joseph Goebbels? It is not known, but it would have been hard for Magda not to know that her stepfather had been imprisoned inside of Buchenwald. He was there for around 8 months before he died, and she could have had him taken out of the camp and saved. Magda Goebbels, though, would become, through the Second World War, a rather hard-faced and brutal woman, who would be a lot more devoted to the Nazi cause than her own family. She was a woman who, at the end of the conflict, lacked compassion, as she arranged for her own children to be murdered inside of Hitler's bunker, and she would even allegedly have a role in poisoning them. She did have the opportunity to save her children, but she would not, and she preferred for them to succumb to death rather than to experience a world without Hitler. With the death of her Jewish stepfather, it's possible to consider that Magda believed that this threat of the truth getting out, which would bring shame onto the Goebbels family at the time, was over, and she may have felt relieved when notified of her stepfather's death. She would, as mentioned, become the closest friend of Hitler, and it's believed that her Nazified way of life caused her not to step in when her stepfather needed her, and instead she left him to rot inside of a German concentration camp. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.